Hey, you are now tuned into People City Propaganda. I'm your host, Jason Reedy, organizer with People City Council. I'm coming to you with sore legs as I start my training for my 10th marathon yesterday.
Wow.
18 weeks of hell until I get to test myself again. I'm joined today in my co-hosted duties by Richie Serjenko.
Hello, hey.
Co-founder and organizer of People City Council, uncle, and movement lawyer.
Yes, well,
Provisionally
pick a struggle, bro. Jeez.
Yeah. How you doing today, Richie?
Great. Uncle to your son, Sahai,
Yeah.
who has been waving a little Palestinian flag around for the past 3 weeks, Free Palestine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also joined by our belated birthday boy, Albert Corrado, the Hot Ones campeon.
I won it alongside you. We fought valiantly. It's like what they call trauma bonding. I think you and I went through that with the bomb sauce. But we live to tell the tale, and we're here. Thank you for the intro, man. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And we are actually joined today by an illustrious guest, veteran organizer and Baba to many in the movement, Greg Akili, or as he prefers to be known as, Akili. Born in the segregated South, Akili grew up in a community with high unemployment, underfunded schools, and crime. As a frustrated teenager, he began getting into some trouble, which resulted in a brief stint in jail at the age of 19. Determined to turn his life around and inspired by a teacher who saw great potential in him, a young Greg Akili became involved in the civil rights and social justice movement. His last name was changed to Akili, Swahili for intelligent, and from that point on, he committed his life to fighting for a fair and just society. Akili has over 50 years of experience as a laborer, community organizer, and political leader. He is among the few people of color to co-found a labor union, which we'll get into in a little bit. And Akili has also dedicated his life to labor, social, and racial justice. He is currently an instructor at UCLA in the Labor Studies Department, the director of the Fannie Lou Hamer Institute, a senior advisor to Los Angeles Black Workers Center, project coordinator with corporate accountability, and core team member for Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And he's also running for California Assembly District 57. And he's now sitting here with us.
Well,
Baba Akili,
Welcome to PCP. We love having you here.
well, and it's good to be in a room with friends and colleagues and people you've been on the front lines with. I have called on many of you a lot over the years to step in and step up to do things as we have been out in these streets protesting. So it's good to be in this room, and it's good to be in being able to share with you all. So I'm glad to be here.
Hey.
So, Akili, as we jump in here, before we get into your illustrious career, tell us about your upbringing. Where were you born? Tell us a bit about your parents, your family, and also we know that you have a deep reverence for Malcolm X. So maybe tell us what he meant to you as well.
Yeah, okay. And Jason, you kind of opened with it. I grew up in the segregated South, the height of Jim Crow, where the custom, the law, and the practice reinforced your second-class status. And I tell this story a lot. I'm with my grandmother, and we are downtown Jacksonville, Florida, and they are repairing a wall. And I asked my grandmother, why do we have to drink out of that fountain that's cracked and is not clean? And you could see it was only one water pipe. Her response to me was, come on here, boy, before you get us in trouble. So that's at 6 or 7 years old. You could see segregation didn't make no sense. And it wasn't like white people was getting no better water. They came from the same pipe. Mm-hmm. So you could see the contradiction then. I was trying to be something I wasn't. I lived in an environment where if you were light-skinned and curly-haired, you had privilege. And I had a choice. I could be a soch or I could be a gut-bug kind of thug. It was much easier to choose the gut-bug thug because I had no responsibilities and all I had was privilege. But I had to then prove it. And there's nothing worse than a wannabe. Because if you want to be hard, if you want to be and live that life, you'll do silly things. I did silly things. Those silly things cost me. I wound up in both state and federal prison, and once again, I was trying to be something I wasn't. And I remember being in federal prison, actually admitting to myself, I simply did not have the heart to be abusive to people. And that's what helped me turn my life around. And I went into Longport Federal Correctional Institution, Greg Terry, 9425, and I came out, I killed it. And I've been on this journey, and I developed 3 basic beliefs. One, that people make a difference if you go to them. It's not enough to have a good idea that you keep in this room. You got to go to people, engage them, educate them. Sometimes fight with them about it, you know what I mean? The second one was that the essence of democracy is inclusion and participation. You can't claim to have a democratic society if you purposely, deliberately, and methodically exclude people. And then finally, we live in the richest country in the world. We can have a just, fair, and equitable society. So it ain't like we can't afford it or like, what we gonna do? No, we make choices. Mm-hmm. We make choices to invest in people and communities, or we don't. We invest in prisons and police. Those are choices. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've tried to, those are my beliefs. And I'm proud of the work that I've done over the past 52 years.
A lot of work.
Well,
a lot of work.
But in trying to live up to those beliefs.
Yeah.
And about 35 years ago, I asked myself this question: what's at stake and what happens if I don't show up? If I could answer the first one, what's at stake, then I had to show up. Sometimes all I could do was just show up. And so I've been showing up ever since. But by asking myself that question, what's at stake? And most of the time, what has been at stake is people's human rights, is social and racial justice. That's what's been at stake. And, showing up just to participate, just showing up to help other people participate, showing up and making the point about showing up has been critical to a lot of the work I've done over the past few years. And I'm proud of my work.
And you've seen it be successful each time that you implement your strategy of calling people in.
Well, but that only is then connected to, once you get called in, you're at least informed enough to know to be there. How can I move you from just being there to taking action? How can I get you to see, understand, and accept? I've been able to get people to see the problem. They know that. I've even been able to get people to understand the problem. It's accepting to take action. Mm-hmm. That has always been the struggle. Because we live in a society where you've been told your voice don't count, your vote don't count, your money don't count. Just leave me alone. And so it's much easier for us to opt out. And for the right wing and others, they purposely try to send that message. So you don't want to get involved. And as an organizer, that shirt that you wear, one of the first things that it says is that we do with people, not for them. If you find yourself doing for people, Fred Ross used to say this, service in them, and they may need it, but it doesn't move them to action. And if you don't move people to action, you don't make change. Mm-hmm. And I've spent, like I said, my life really trying to understand, yes, I came up with these beliefs, but then how do you implement them? Yeah. How do you make them real?
And so you talked about you're born in Jacksonville. When did you make it your way to California? Take us through that.
My mother died in 1964. My father was out here in San Diego in the service, and I think I was about 14, 15 years old.
Okay.
That clearly is a traumatic experience. Mm-hmm. And worse than that, she died in a fire that I pulled her out of. She was a nurse, and she worked those hours. She worked from 11 to 7, so she could go to work when my brother and I would sleep, but be back home in enough time to when we got up to make sure we got to school. Right. And, she was tired and in those days, people smoked a lot, and fell asleep on the couch, and one of the cigarette smoldered and consumed her. And by the time I got there, it was too late. So anyway, I wound up moving out here to San Diego. My father was in the Navy. I was in a new environment. So I had come from this very restrictive environment, where you knew where everything was, you knew where to go and where not to go, because there was signs that told you that. I moved out here in San Diego, you knew where to go and not to go, but the signs weren't there.
Okay.
There were economic signs, but there were signs nonetheless, and you knew where to go and where not to go. I wound up bringing some of the bad habits I had established in Florida as a young person out here with me, in an effort to belong, in an effort to get in and fit in. And I did silly things. And people ask me, so brother, why you get arrested? I got arrested for being stupid. Now, there's no law against being stupid. You must know that.
Yes.
But there is a law against doing stupid things.
Yes.
And in an effort
You
to
know
get
that.
along, and in an effort to get in, I did stupid things. I was a wannabe, and you could get me to do stupid things, and I did them. And I wound up doing a little state time and a lot more federal time. And that's from the first 14, 15 years, and then the second 10 years, because now I'm 22, 23 years old, I'm getting out the penitentiary. I had become a leader within the prison I was in. We had started something called the Afro-American Cultural Workshop. We brought in education programs. We brought in a play, and that made it. We brought in this play called Ceremonies and Old Dark Men.
Okay.
And it caused us to stay up later than lockdown. And when we first got started, brothers was like, I ain't gonna work on my parole with that. And then we brought in this play, and we got to stay beyond 9 o'clock before they locked us down. They would start flocking to us, and I think that in large part is when I began to accept one, that I had a responsibility to be a leader and to try to lead. And so that also cost us in the sense that the police were a bit disturbed about some of the work we were doing. I remember there was a riot in the penitentiary, and the warden called me in as if somehow or another I was supposed to talk people out of it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, no, ain't nothing I can do. And so, and in large part, it wasn't a riot, that they called it that, sure. But it was a pushback against two things. And y'all are making me tell stories.
We love it. We love it.
One was,
it's going to be a long episode. We want to hear all the stories.
Definitely. One was we wanted more access like that so we could have more programs like that, and we wanted more resources. The other one was about food. The food in the penitentiary was just bad. I worked in the bakery, and every other Friday, we would cook donuts in the fish grease from the week before. Wow. And it smelled up the whole penitentiary. And we used to tell the police, ain't nobody gonna eat these donuts. And nobody did, because it smelled like, and to this day, I barely eat donuts.
Honestly, though, fish donuts could maybe take off now. So
maybe so, But and the police would tell us, tell us to cook a pound of potatoes in the fish grease, and that would clean it up. And so, but it never did, and people complained about it, and so we wound up pushing back and not going to work and some other stuff. And I remember being called in by the warden to ask me if I would talk to people. And I, of course, said no. First of all, we think what we're asking for is legitimate. So it ain't like, we don't want these fish grease donuts, and we want more of these programs. We wound up getting more programs. They did stop cooking the donuts and fish grease, but they went back to it.
Okay.
Because the police made the argument that it was safe, it was clean, and more cost effective, which is an argument you have heard many times before. But interesting for me, that began to shape a lot of what I ultimately came out and did. That's how I went from being Greg Terry to Akili, was the leadership that I wound up developing within the federal prison. I remember when I first got there, we got there late that night because I was being transferred from San Diego and it was late, and I had a big natural, big fro and stuff, and of course they cut your hair in the penitentiary. So I get there, it's like I think 2:00 in the morning, and I'm resisting. I ain't cutting my hair. They put me in the hole.
Wow.
Just because they ain't had time for it. And in my underwear. And by the morning, I was saying, come cut my hair. So I could get out. So there are other stories like that. And the fact that I remember to this day, 9425. I was the 9,425th person to go in federal prison that day. There are two numbers, 5454 and 9425, which I remember to this day. Those are prison numbers. That they stick with you. Those two have stuck with me.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
So I'm going to stop now.
Okay. So you get out, and the first organization that I was able, when I did my research that you were a part of, was the National Involvement Association, also known as the NIA
Cultural Organization.
which was formed in 1970 in San Diego. Can you tell us about the birth of NIA, when you joined the ranks, and what attracted you to that organization specifically?
Well, NIA was quite frankly an outgrowth of the US organization, which was really based here in Los Angeles. In the late 60s, early 70s, Dr. Maulana Karenga, they had both internal and external conditions that caused splits. Maulana had been sequestered. He started taking barbiturates to stay up, and then he took drugs to go to sleep. And it was also at the time of this conflict with the Panther Party. And the combination of the external conditions which the COINTELPRO contributed to by sending us messages and sending them messages about and all that kind of stuff, it caused a split within the organization. Some people stayed with Maulana. Maulana wound up going to prison, I think, in 1974, because I was out by then. For basically torturing some people. And it wound up, he didn't do it himself, but according to a lot of the information, he had it done, or he knew about it.
Yep.
And so NIA, which had been a part of the Los Angeles organization, just split and started another NIA cultural organization. And at the time, Imamu Sukumu, who I talked with yesterday, was the head of it. There were 4 imamus, faith leaders, Imamu Sukumu, Imamu Halisi, Imamu Baraka, and there was another one. Who was it? There was a 4th one. So anyway, I got involved with NIA Cultural Organization, in large part because I had met Maulana before I went to prison. But I was, in those days, I was much more a petty hoodlum than, and I would hang around stuff that was happening. I would listen to Malcolm. I would show up at the Panthers rally and the rest, but I didn't do nothing. I was like a lot of brothers. And because they had a lot of fine women.
Okay.
And I'm serious. I mean, it's like, you know.
At that age,
Well, but you hear people talking about how they go to church.
Yes.
Well, and why? Well, that was a part of it. But I didn't.
Or gone.
Yes. Yeah. After them fine women. But I didn't ever do anything. I just kind of showed up and repeated the rally cries and all the rest, But it wasn't until I went to federal prison. I had already been introduced to a lot of this. I had certainly been listening to Malcolm. I had a friend of mine who had reel-to-reel tapes of Malcolm, these big old reel-to-reel tapes of Malcolm. And we used to listen to them, just listen to him talk. Malcolm was the first person, I think this for me must have been 68, 69, because 69 I was gone. I heard Malcolm talk about the Vietnamese and how the Vietnamese were winning. I could not, because in those days, if you were not patriotic and you didn't support the war and all the rest, then you were ostracized. And I remember my father and I having this big fallout. Well, we had 2 big fallouts. One when I changed my name, because he was like, "You don't know nothing about Africa," and that's my name, and I worked hard for my name. And then the war in Vietnam. I certainly didn't support it. But the fact that the first person I ever heard talk about it and talk about how the Vietnamese were winning and why the U.S. was wrong was Malcolm X. 3 or 4 years before Martin Luther King had come to it. Mm-hmm. So that was my introduction, not to Malcolm. Malcolm had become the father of Black nationalism. Garvey was considered the grandfather, but Malcolm really, I think, took Black nationalism, that is, we were a people with a common history, common set of conditions, and a common goal, and then connected that to Pan-Africanism. And one of the things that attracted a whole generation to Malcolm was Malcolm talked and said the things that we all thought and wanted to do and say, but didn't. And the difference between Malcolm and Martin, in my mind, Martin engaged in protests and challenging the conditions. Malcolm summed it up and talked about why you needed to challenge and how you needed to stand up. And many of us gravitated to that. Too often there is this, I think, false dichotomy that somehow or another, you can have Malcolm or Martin. They both, I think, represented the same side. Martin was on the ground. He engaged in direct action. Malcolm framed why we needed a substantive, transformative change and introduced concepts like human rights. Civil rights are granted to you legally and can be taken. Human rights are what you're born with. And that's why, to this day, the definition of Black power is self-respect, self-determination, and self-defense. That grows directly out of Malcolm. And certainly Malcolm was an influence on me in many ways because our lives paralleled. We both became conscious being locked up. Now, I certainly had been introduced to it. I certainly was around it, but I didn't do anything. But certainly by the time I was locked up, it began to have meaning to me. His experience had meaning to me. Now, I didn't do as much time as he did, thankfully, but it had the same impact on me. So I, like him, I come out, I adopt. One of the first acts of self-determination was getting a name. And yesterday, Shannon heard the person who gave me the name, and I was thinking, what? How? Because it's been a long time ago. So I called my friend Sakumu, who actually gave me the name, and it was like, why'd you give me that? And part of what he said was, I was, just a hipster, a jokester, before I got locked up. But when I came out, I was serious. And so he thought to give me that name. And it is a part of the change in my life, because once you get a name like that, you got to halfway ass act like it. You know what I mean? You got to try to live up to that.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to do that, but I had to be reminded about how I got the name and why. And in the organization in NEA at the time, you got a name according to an attribute or a quality you had or aspired to. And so that was a part of me changing my life, moving from this petty hoodlum, this person who's trying to live that life, this person who's trying to be fast and slick and stuff, to somebody who wants to commit to making a real change, and getting involved and stuff. I had been a disc jockey before I got locked up in San Diego and a small town in Tyler, Texas. And so I wound up during the Model Cities program. I knew some people, and we had started a radio station, and we started Kuumba Time, Creativity. And I wound up being, almost through default, the program director. And so we had a full day of music and poetry and consciousness on the PBS channel. And I was and I'm going to say this with all due humility and all due
where's this going?
Oh God. I said it once before in front of Melina and Jan, and now they tease me. But I was the thin man with the massive musical plan, 137 pounds of pure granulated sugar in your ear. See, I'll be your friend, your partner, your pal, your brother. I'll be the one when you think you can't find another.
Amazing. I love that.
God forbid.
What were the hot tracks back when you were radio?
All of Al Green.
Okay.
All of certainly Earth, Wind and Fire had just come on the scene then, because this is now in the mid 70s, the early 70s. The Dramatics, most of the hits of the 70s and 80s, and then I didn't find. I'd been on the radio before as a thin man, so I didn't.
You wore the bell bottoms too?
Oh shit, yeah.
Oh yeah.
You're allowed to curse. Yeah.
Fuck. Yeah.
And the open shirts with yes, I did that. But I was becoming more and more disenchanted with just being a disc jockey, and so I've transitioned to a talk show.
Okay.
Where I interviewed people as a part in the community about issues, and I found that much more rewarding, much more fulfilling and much more substantive. And over time, as I got more and more involved, I just kind of drifted away from radio. But in those days, I was a disc jockey.
Beautiful. I did not know that.
137 pounds. Wow, that's
A pure granulated sugar. Hit your head there. Look at here.
If we could, I wanted to talk about and examine three major undertakings taken up by NIA. One was around the death penalty. And so in 1972, California abolished the death penalty, but Ronald Reagan helped lead the effort to amend the California Constitution to permit it shortly after. This was a very contentious issue in the state of California in the 1870s. For our listeners, can you kind of describe the landscape at that time and what NIA was doing about it?
Well, the people on death row were black, and certainly cultural nationalism. That, by the way, that definition, those terms wound up being the kind of positions that there was some beef around: cultural nationalism and liberation nationalism. It was more personalities and egos than anything.
Sure.
But the idea that the state, which is racist, is going to put to death people, and most of the people they put to death is going to be black, we oppose that. From that day to this, I mean, I was just recently, there was a Prop 34 here in California that would have overturned the death penalty. And I was the Southern California coordinator for it because I've been on that front line for a long time. But one of the things that we learned then, and it was reinforced lately, was that the death penalty is not about punishment, it's about revenge. It's not about, it's about how do you send a message, both using the institutions to do it, that you are not accepted in this society. Because most of the people on death row then and now, were black. And if you have a state that is racist, then that's, the difference between what happened between 1889 and 1956, that's the time period of the lynching period. If you go to the lynching museum in Mobile, Alabama, you'll see it. It stopped, so you couldn't lynch us as easily and as often anymore. But what wound up taking its place is the death penalty, and that's been sanctioned by the state. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, we would oppose that. And so I was very much involved in both protests and what was happening at the time. Jerry Brown had become governor the first time. I worked in his presidential campaign in 1980. I can tell you about that. But he had come out of the Jesuit. He had even talked about being a Jesuit priest. But he had come out of that environment where he opposed the death penalty. He appointed to the California State Supreme Court Rose Byrd, and she was opposed to the death penalty. And so they began to overturn death penalty. You still got life in prison, but there was no longer there. The right wing literally put an initiative on the ballot to take down Rose Byrd and took her off the California State Supreme Court because of her support for ending the death penalty. And many of us fought that fight. And in those days, the right wing, primarily based in Southern California, in Orange County and San Diego, and it was here too, but they were certainly much more visible and vicious in San Diego and a military town and Orange County. They still had a large impact on public policy here. And they began to mobilize and organize, and so they got rid of her. A few years later, Howard Jarvis introduced something called Prop 13 that would basically standardize the taxing across all property owners. It was one of the worst decisions that was made in this state. Now, for homeowners, it was great because it made sure that you only paid a really marginal tax. But for commercial people, big corporations, it was a windfall because all of a sudden their property taxes were also equalized out. And so you had these major corporations paying little, well, I shouldn't say no tax, but they were paying, in comparison to the worth of their property. And so that then had an immediate economic effect on schools, first of all, because our schools were funded that way. And the second impact that it had was on investing in municipalities and communities, connected to it. So all of a sudden, property tax was shrunk at the local level. The state had then to step in to fund things, and it had to raise taxes in other ways. And so Prop 13, they call it now the third rail. You can't talk about it. And there's been a couple of efforts to do a split roll tax. That is, takes the commercial properties off that, out of that spectrum, and have them pay what they rightfully should, and keep the property taxes, homeowner taxes, flat, or at least payable.
Yeah.
It hasn't worked yet, in large part because major corporations have fought tooth and nail against it. But in those days, fighting against the death penalty was a continuation of the Black nationalist movement that I was a part of, because Black people were being more likely on death row and killed. And one of the things that we saw in the fight against the death penalty was it had nothing to do with stopping crime or slowing down. Had everything to do with revenge. Much like the same thing that happened when they used to lynch us. And so we, of course, were against that. And so Nia, Sukumu, and I, and others, Msemaji, were against it.
Yeah. Another thing y'all were involved with was the anti-apartheid.
Apartheid.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in 1978, it was revealed that the city and county of San Diego were secretly investing its pension and retirement funds in apartheid South Africa. You were quoted at the time as saying, "San Diego money is being used to prop up a racist regime. We feel there are alternatives that are just as productive." Can you speak on how Nia led the fight around divesting money from the apartheid regime?
That's another one of the things I'm proud of. I'm truly proud of that. It took us a few years, but we finally got the city to divest. I wasn't quite as successful with the county, but we got the city to divest, and we did a number of activities and programs that really wound up engaging people. The best part of it was South Africans were fighting themselves. And so we could, Mandela was still in prison at the time. I remember bringing over people from South Africa, from Namibia, Zambia, and South Africa, from the ANC, from ZAPO and SWAPO, and doing a tour. Matter of fact, we did a press conference in LA, and there was a plane crash, and the cameras just actually picked up and left, and the brothers from Africa was like, "Wow, what is that?" And it was serious. But that was one of the other things I'm glad I was a part of. From NIA, we started something called the Anti-Apartheid Coalition, and we focused on getting the city to divest. We finally got that to happen through a lot of pressure. And one of the things I've observed about movements, they seem to have these four things in common. They all start out with a set of demands. Women wanted the right to vote, and that was their demand. Workers wanted an 8-hour workday and a 5-day work week, and a minimum wage. Civil rights, we wanted an end to Jim Crow, and we wanted to be included in a society that we helped build. So those sets of demands, you make those demands against the established powers, they are always rejected as too extreme, as too, we can't do that, that'll never work, and it's rejected. If you hold to them demands, you're setting up a challenge. And if you're going to challenge power, you're going to have to confront, and you're going to be in confrontation. So challenge, confrontation, and that's going to lead to disruption. Mm-hmm. Those are what I've observed about movements. Almost all movements, including the one I'm involved with Black Lives Matter, starts with a set of demands. The demands are never granted. The demands lead to challenge. The challenge leads to confrontation. The confrontations lead to disruption. And then over time, you begin to make change because you disrupt the society to the point where other people at large begin to see that, well, you're right. Yeah. From 1838 to 1920. That's how long 1848. That's how long it took women to get the right to vote. Now, it does, once you make the demands, you stick with them, then that's what's going to happen. Now, if you move on them or you negotiate them or you talk about reforms or whatever, then it may not take as long. But generally, if you hold to those demands, you're going to go through them 3 processes: the challenge, confrontation, disruption. That was the elements that we use to get the city to finally divest. But we had the demands and the struggles of the South African people. And one of the things that used to constantly be said is we're trying to help by investing in corporations that are oppressing the people, the investment somehow will make the country better, and then ultimately they'll be able to, and that logic just don't ring. I mean, that does not pass the smell test. No. You just want to make more money. That's all that is, and if we can, and I used to get this argument, well, you're going to hurt the people of South Africa. They're the one demanding it. So that was one of the things that I was most proud of. And so here it is this is the 70s and 80s. In 1994, I go back to the city council after having fought to get them to divest. I go back with the ambassador from South Africa to get them to invest.
Okay.
That, clearly is a highlight for me.
Yeah.
After struggling and supporting the demands of the South African people, and then being able to go back 15 years later and say, okay, now we're standing with the South African people, and we want that level of investment. We want that level of support because they have ended apartheid. And we should support their efforts to advance. And so that was clearly a highlight. On one hand, I'm challenging the city council. I'm shutting the city council down. I'm using the voice that I got so that they can't meet. They can't do nothing. 1 year, 15 years later, I'm saying, well, I'm back, but not to shut y'all down. But to lift you up.
Yep.
And make better decisions about human rights. And how you can support human rights. So that and founding UDW was clearly some highlights.
The last part I want to talk about was with Nia was police murder.
Yeah, yes.
And today we were at Police Commission when they actually ruled out of policy the murder of Keenan Anderson. But you've been fighting on the front lines against police murder since the 70s. With Tyrone Thomas was somebody that had come up during my research. Can you just give us a little bit about
you, Doug? If I remember correctly, this was another classic example of, and I talked about it today. Police are trained to control and suppress, control the threat and suppress the danger. They see us as a threat. And so anytime we do anything, anytime we resist, anytime we ask questions, anytime we don't follow immediately their instructions, they move to control and suppress. And that's what happened, if I remember correctly, in this case. And it was a classic, I shouldn't say classic. It was an example of escalation and the police using their powers to hurt, harm, and ultimately kill a person who had borderline done nothing. The other side of that, if I can remember correctly, there was a young man who fought the police and actually took a couple of them out, and he got off because the police were, you could see that their tactics were unnecessary. Tyrone's case, that was one of the first, and it was one of the continuation of the mobilization that exists in our community when we have been wronged. And what Black Lives Matter has done is take that mobilization, take that wrong, and be able to sustain it and continue it. And in some cases, advance it, like what happened today. So, but that was the first time of many that I and others challenged the police, challenged their practice, but more importantly, challenged the public officials who allowed this to happen, and in their names, with our money. We were not quite as sophisticated as we are now. All we knew that this was wrong, and that we were not going to accept it. And what is common is the concept of shutting it down, of not making the disruption, of not making it so that you can continue to act and engage in and hurt, harm, and kill people like you have been.
So also in the 70s, you started organizing with the United Farm Workers.
Yes.
So for everyone listening, just, little story time. In 2020, I met Akili. We were organizing with People's Budget LA. And we just started to get to know each other. And, I had mentioned something to Dr. Molina about my uncle, Stephen Rivers, who, had organized with the United Farm Workers very closely back in the 70s with Cesar Chavez. She was like, oh, no way. Like Akili also organized United Farm Workers. You should ask him. And so I was like, oh, Akili, do you know my uncle Stephen Rivers? And come to find out, you all organized together back in the day. And I just thought it was a very special moment for me because my uncle, left us a few decades ago. And I moved to California to be with my uncle and try to pursue, the life that he lived. And here I am in one of my first organizing efforts. I get to work with someone that works with my uncle. So it was, it is an honor to work with you, regardless because of the person you are. But that, we have that connection. It was a really interesting moment, and I just appreciate you. And do you want to talk about the United Farm Workers a little bit?
Absolutely. And let me tell you how we got there. We could see Black nationalism in and of itself would not be enough to get us where we wanted to go. We had to be in partnership with other like-minded people and other like-minded groups. And we always, respected Cesar. The first thing I ever did with the farm workers, with Cesar in particular, was Prop 14, where the farm workers wanted to have a law that allowed them to organize. And so they put an initiative on the ballot to do that. And that was Prop 14, and it would allow farm workers basically to organize a union, just like any other people can do. And so we were evolving and developing then, and we made alliances with other groups, and the farm workers had been one of them. And so working on Prop 14 to help get that first on the ballot, we had to get over 600,000 signatures in 6 weeks, statewide.
Wow.
And most of the signature gathering approaches that you all take for granted now, using the ironing board, the idea of having two people, one would be a barker, the other one would show people how to sign, folks at three clipboards at a time. That all came out of the effort to put Prop 14 on the ballot. Those were Fred Ross, who found and trained Cesar, and me, and a whole generation of us, didn't like cardboard tables because, it looked like you weren't serious, first of all, and you had to bend over. So he said, get some ironing boards. People don't have to, you can stand up. You don't have to bend over. And so we started using the ironing boards. And then he said, put multiple clipboards on the ironing board. Then you could get 3 or 4 people. And then you have a barker, a barker, just like at the carnival, step right up in. And so that's how we were able to, and for everybody who we got to sign, it was like, give a nickel to farm workers. We raised thousands of dollars off a nickel, and people would give us a nickel. And then we upped it to 50 cents. Give 50 cents to the farm workers. We started a nickel, and then and so that was our first, we worked together. And then as we were expanding, that's a NEO, a cultural organization, we worked with Tom Hayden. Many of us had worked with Tom before in the anti-war movement, but with Tom Hayden and Jane during the anti-war movement. And then Tom wanted to start the Campaign for Economic Democracy, which Stephen worked with, by the way, and was if I remember correctly, the press director, the public and communications director. So we had begun to look at people who we could work with, who had values and principles we could deal with, and the farm workers were one. And so I wound up working with the farm workers, and then Cesar said to us, neocultural organization, I need Akili to come help us organize grape workers. And we had a lot of regard and respect for Cesar at the time. And so I did. I spent 6 weeks organizing grape workers in Bakersfield, Wheat Patch, all up and down the valley. And even before that, I had organized in Coachella. And this lettuce workers, look again. Picking lettuce is hard. You are bent over all the time. One of the first successes of the farm worker movement was outlawing the short handle hoe. Woo! Because that was hard work. I organized unga workers or mushroom workers. That was hard work in Oxnard. You go into this little house, and you can't stand up. It's dark. It's hot, and you pick mushrooms. And one of the things I learned from that experience, if there wasn't going to be no justice for farm workers, the people who pick the fruits and vegetables and stuff for us, there wasn't going to be no justice for the rest of us.
Right.
And much of those beliefs that I wound up developing in large part came from Cesar. And one of the things that that happened with me is what we had been engaged in the Pan-Africanist and nationalist movement was mobilizations, that we did mobilize a lot of people, but we didn't always build something to keep it going. We could get crowds together. We could have great motivational speakers, and that was absolutely and unquestionably necessary and meaningful. But it was what you did next that was important. And that's where I began to learn the nuts and bolts of organizing through my work with Cesar. And then that led us to the founding of the the Domestic Workers Union, because Cesar had said, had he not been successful organizing farm workers, he would have organized domestic workers, because those were the two groups of workers who were left out of the National Labor Relations Act, and who the Roosevelt administration cut a deal with the Dixiecrats to get the National Labor Relations Act and Social Security. And so he had said, had he not been successful organizing farm workers, he would have organized domestic workers. And all of us, me and Samaji Fahadi, that was the leadership of NIA at the time, had domestic workers in our background. My grandmother had been a domestic worker. Samaji's aunts had been domestic workers. Fahadi's mother was a domestic worker. And so the idea of doing it was, we thought, okay, let's give it a shot. We didn't trust labor, though. We saw labor as rich, fat, white, and lazy. And so we didn't do very much with labor at the time. But Cesar convinced us, gave us money, gave us $1,500 a month, which was a lot of money, and sent Fred Ross to train me. And that method he trained us in, that house meeting method, I still use to this day. I still introduce and share that with people. And it's a labor intensive, and somewhat focused work, but it's me getting you to talk to 3 other people to come to your house so I can talk to them about how we can build a movement for farm workers or domestic workers. But the other thing about my relationship and work with farm workers was being around Cesar and seeing how he made decisions, seeing how he facilitated things being done. Cesar, first of all, 2 principles. That one about we do with people and for people, well, that certainly came from Fred. But Cesar used to say, we don't organize people so that we can speak. We organize workers so that they can speak for themselves. Right. They can do that well. And that to this day, by the way, is a mantra, I still do that. The other thing is getting people to move beyond the speeches to taking action. And then thirdly, building something. My definition of organizing is getting people together in their own behalf around their own beliefs, getting them to accept responsibility for making change by doing the work, and setting up a committee, an organization that protects, promotes, and defends the interests you say you have and want to advance. That's what organizing is to me. I know that there's a very broad definition of organizing now that I hear a lot, and a lot of it has to do with logistics. And one of the things I do is I try to draw a distinction between putting things in order and organizing people.
Yeah.
We can set these chairs in order, but for me, that's putting things in order. Organizing people is about building power. And one of the things that I focus on is how do we build the power we need to make the changes we say we deserve, we want, and will improve the conditions of our lives. Two things. One, we supported the Filipinos in their efforts against taking down, at that time, Marcos, who had become a dictator. But many of the people in the farm worker movement were Filipinos. As a matter of fact, it was the United Farm Workers Union was the coming together of the Filipino farm workers and the Chicano farm workers and the Latino farm workers. As a matter of the vice president, the leader of the United Farm Workers Union was a Filipino. But so we supported the young people on the ground who were fighting against Marcos. And so we're having this meeting in La Paz where Cesar is, and Cesar has committed to meet with him, and because he had committed that to the Filipinos many years ago, because they still saw Marcos as the hero that had freed them from the Japanese and World War II and the rest. And so we're sitting in we're sitting in Cesar's office, and we're debating with him about that, and it's and he's listening to these 25-year-olds. I mean, just being infinitely patient with us. This is Cesar Chavez, the head of a union and shit. He's listening to us, and I got a little animated. And Cesar was given. He loved shepherds and cameras, and so he had been given these two shepherds, Welga and Borgard. And they were with him all the time, and they were in the office, and my animation and the tone. So I remember one of them came and got in between me and Cesar. The other one came and sat next to me. That calmed me down.
They're ready to attack.
Well, yeah, but more importantly, what that reminded me of is I'm talking to Cesar Chavez, and I'm trying to convince him about the righteousness of our struggle, and he's reminding us that these are his members. These are the people who helped him found the union. And so, yes, and he didn't agree with Marcos. He opposed Marcos. Well, he publicly opposed Marcos, but he had committed to the members that he was going to do that. And he said, once you get a union, and your members are calling on you, then you have to respond. He also reminded me, and those of us in the room at the time, that in 1969, before the Union was, as it was forming, they opposed the war in Vietnam, much to the opposition of their own members, because they thought it was a wrong war. And they had relationships with people, and they learned about this was a wrong war. It didn't go over well. And for a long time, Cesar and Dolores and people who were in the leadership of farm workers had to constantly meet with and struggle with and educate farm workers about why this was an unjust war. So the fact that he was willing to take that risk, because he didn't have to. I mean, the farm workers could have gone on and not opposed the war, And he reminded me of both. He reminded me that in this case, his members, his Filipino members, he made this commitment to. While he didn't agree with Marcos' dictatorship, he had to live up to his commitment to the people that helped him form the union, help him sustain the union, and help him advance the union. And so he said, I get your point, but I got to do this. And he reminded us about the struggles that they had in 1969 opposing the Vietnam War. So those are, and I'm really, really, really.
Okay, but let's talk about the domestic workers.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because this is the great accomplishment of yours. We can do this quickly, but you should at least be able to elaborate and brag a little bit about this is the first of its kind, and you led the movement. So just give a little background, and then we got corporate accountability at the end of the 70s. You got a freaking packed
Where did
history.
you find all this
It's
time,
like,
man? Like, I'm
Jesus.
wondering how the hell you did all this.
Well, remember, I'd asked myself, what's at stake and what happens if I don't show up?
Yeah.
So these were the things that were at stake. Very quickly, I'd mentioned, so I'd worked with the farm workers on a number of different campaigns. It was hard to tell Cesar no, because, we admired him so much. So we're meeting with Cesar in the pause at his little house.
Sorry.
And Cesar says, had he not been successful organizing farm workers, thank you so much, he would have organized domestic workers, and that somebody needs to do it. We talked about it later. We said, okay, we'll give it a shot. He says, okay, I'll send Fred Ross to come train you. I'll give you $1,500 a month because you're going to need some money, and I'll support you. And they train us in this house meeting organizing. And because domestic workers don't have a work site, that meant that I would have to get on the bus every morning and literally talk to. We found out where the sites that they would stage to get on the bus and where they would go, and I would ride the bus all day.
Wow.
From early in the morning and they went to the wealthier parts of San Diego, Point Loma, La Jolla, and I would literally ride home and ride back with them. And I had these little 3x5 cards, and I would just start talking to people, and are you a domestic worker? And at first they were reluctant because like, who is this? And you just keep talking. And if they see you every day, and they would, because we would ride the bus, and so over time they would begin to talk. And, if I would introduce myself. At that time, I think we were with the Domestic Workers Service Center. And domestic workers are getting together to create a service center for themselves. I'd like to talk to you more about it. What area of town do you live in? Well, I live over on 35th Street. You know what? I'm going to be in that area this evening, probably around 7 o'clock. Do you mind if I stop by to see you? And that's how we got, and I would get their names. I would go by and see them. I would talk to them about the fact that we're going to build a union, and we needed them to invite in, because they knew each other, they're friends, so that we could, start this union. And over time, what we wound up happening was meeting what was home care workers. They became the bulk of the people that we were organizing. And so we wound up, that became the bulk of our membership. But it took from 1977 through 1978. And what we would do is have a series of house meetings throughout the city, or the city, in different parts of the city. Then the people from those house meetings, we would have what we call regional meetings. And from those regional meetings, we would have a citywide convention. And that's how we founded the United Domestic Workers Union. And our first series of successes was, first of all, even doing it, because people said it couldn't be done. And then secondly, one of the things that we found that the counties were subcontracting this work out. And so, wow, we had a target, because they took care of people in their homes, the home care workers. In many cases, they took care of their relatives. And, so that meant that there was no one place they were. So that's why we had to ride the buses. That's why we had to meet them where they were. And we began to get them together. We found that the County of San Diego was contracting out the work. We were able to, bring them together enough so that we actually could get a contract, small one, that improved their conditions. And this was the equivalent to a temp agency. It was a temp agency, but that became our first success. And we went, in every place they had offices, we wound up going there. So I think we went from San Diego to Riverside to Santa Barbara to Redwood to Inland. So and that's how we finally got our first series of contracts. But ultimately, what we had to do was establish an employer, because the IHSS program comes from the feds, goes to the state sends it to the county administers, but along the way, none of them were the employers. And so it was hard. Who you going to negotiate with? How you going? Over time, and SEIU, this is SEIU's genius, they established something called the public authority. And the public authority was set up by the counties to basically administer the IJSS program. And once there was a public authority, we had a bargaining. That's who we could bargain with. But that took 35 years to get to that. But that's how we got started. I remember recruiting people from Northeast University, from Cornell, and training them. And I trained organizers just like I was trained. Fred used to go out with me, as I did the one-on-ones, and he would sit in the corner, wouldn't say a thing. And when we got in the car, he would give me the feedback. And that's exactly how I wound up training people for many, up until, I guess the 90s, the late 80s. I trained organizers here for Anthony Thigpen in that same method. That I would go out with you and I would sit there and observe. And then when we left, I'd give you immediate feedback, and and the other thing is that there was a tracking system. So we would take a wall, and your name would be at the top, and the number, the people who you're going to visit on the sides, and the number of personal visits you were going to do, the number of house meetings that came from it, and the results. And we would take up a whole wall to do that. And every morning, you had to report on your visits, house meeting came from it, it proved to be, it was the nuts and bolts of the organizing that I understand today.
And how did you feel all this in the 70s, and then you also started with corporate accountability in 78 with the Nestle boycott?
Yes.
How
Nestle.
Nasty.
Many of the people who I'd worked with in the farm worker movement had were moved on and were doing other things. And one of the things that happened, that they started, it was called Impact at the time, was Nestle was giving away infant formula to East African women. That and if you don't have clean water, then you were literally threatening and killing babies. But what Nestle wanted to do was build their market. So they thought that by giving away and introducing East African women to modernity, to the modern, now look here, we have been breastfeeding for thousands of years, you know what I mean? And all of a sudden, Nestle decides we got a better way for you. But they give it away. The babies are sick, some are even dying because they don't have clean water. A group of people learned about it and said this ain't right. They approached Nestle about stopping it. Nestle increased it. And certainly I had been working in Pan-African activities anyway. So when the people I had worked with in the farm workers movement, they called me and said, come help us. And so I did. So I joined the Nestle boycott. I was a part of that. And it was really an extension of the other boycotts, because many of us came out of the farm worker movement. So we knew this stuff, and we knew how to use it, and so I became involved in that and helped ultimately get Nestle to stop, to get the UN to sanction them.
Wow.
Get, not, I wouldn't call it reparations, but I would call it some form of compensation that for some of the families. It was not what we wanted. It was not the contract we wanted, or the agreement we wanted. But it did stop Nestle. And this was in '78, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Yep.
And now I'm a project coordinator for that same group. And we focused on, in between that, focused on tobacco. I was on the board of IMFACT in the mid '90s, and I wound up doing. I had taken these techniques that I had learned over the years, and we wound up disrupting Philip Morris board meetings, and came that close to having the Richmond, Virginia police arrest us. But some other disturbance, more important, took them away.
Nestle, by the way, a company that still over the years has done a lot of fucked up shit.
It is.
But they also make Nesquik, so just saying.
Didn't they overthrow government?
They're also like responsible for like stealing water from a lot of places. It's just a whole fucking
From
thing.
native peoples in particular,
Yeah.
in the Great Lakes region, they got a permit to pump water, to pump the water, and that they bottle, and the permit costs, I think, $3,000 a year. They're making millions off of it, and the people in the Great Lakes have been fighting against that for many years. That one, the state should not have. They're literally giving it to them, and two, that they are robbing native peoples of their water. So Nestle is not one of the companies I hold in good light. And my work with corporate accountability has been around tobacco in the mid-'90s, and now it's around water again, stopping the privatization of water nationally and internationally. And that's one of the. I'm on the water.
That's an important fight because the water wars are coming on.
They're probably that's true.
A decade or two away.
What these stories have done, I hope, is give you a picture of me being on the front lines for all these years.
But I think what it's also going to do is I think it's going to show people that, like, if you want to be in this work, if you're in this work, it just takes a lot of time, and you have to remain in the fight and also have many things going on at once. Because it seemed like you weren't just focusing on one thing or another. It was like you were focusing on a few things and just kind of like checking in and working on them. And I feel like that's what you kind of have to do.
But they were in phases. That is, I would focus on the anti-apartheid movement. That was the focus.
Yeah.
And we tried to raise money and sustain ourselves. We weren't always successful, but that was during the course of the year. And so there may have been other projects, but we tried to. Certainly, I've tried to stay focused on the campaigns that I'm interested in, that I was called in then. And it's not always hard. One of the things that I say now, I made the decision to do this work, and I'm proud of it. But my family sacrificed. I never called this work a sacrifice. I never made a sacrifice. I made a choice. My family made the sacrifice. The relationships I was in, certainly my children, they made the sacrifice. And one of the quotes on that shirt is that, social justice, human rights work is not a choice. I mean, it's not a sacrifice, it's a choice.
Yeah.
And if you choose to do it, yes, it certainly can be time consuming. And, it's not always been good for relationships. So I made the decision, but my family paid the price.
Damn. Well, I would love to hear more about that, but we are going to move on to the 1980s. We're getting down this list. So in the 1980s, you were coordinator for the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, a labor union representing migrant farm workers in the Midwest and North Carolina. Can you detail some of the work you did with them?
Yeah, but that was the continuation of my relationship with the farm workers, because Cesar asked me to do it.
Okay.
Right.
And it was Valdemar Velasquez. Valdemar had watched and learned from Cesar. He had come out to, Valdemar was based in Ohio at the time, had come out to La Paz where Cesar was. And what he was trying to do is get the UFW to come out to where he was. But Cesar didn't have the bandwidth, you call it bandwidth now, but he didn't have the resources to do that. But he did say, I'll support you. So the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, FLOC as it was called, organized in the Midwest, in Ohio and Michigan. And Cesar called me and asked Fred to go out and train their organizers in the same way that we had been trained. And the FLOC had started the Campbell soup boycott.
It's like you're moving down the list. We haven't even showed you the list, and you're just like moving down it. This is great.
So they started the Campbell soup boycott, and
this boycott, and then
but a lot of it came from Cesar's influence.
Yeah,
Cesar and Valdemar talked almost daily, if not daily, because he was trying to understand and apply what Cesar was doing. And so I went there for, I guess it was 6 weeks to train their organizers. And it was in Ohio and Michigan, in Bay City and Omar, and in the rural counties in Ohio and Michigan. And they ultimately got what they were, through the boycott and through the organizing, because the boycott simply set up the pressure on the growers and the industry to to see that it's in their interest to deal with the farm workers, but the farm workers had to be organized themselves. So you had to do both. You had to organize farm workers so that they would participate and that they would, be their own spokespersons and voice, and you had to be able to apply pressure on the industry. And Flock did that good. They learned those lessons from Cesar. He did it with both the Great Boycott. He did it with, I think the Great Boycott and Gallows are two of the ones that stand out. And so they learned that lesson and applied it. And one of the things Cesar learned early on is that you only have to affect a small percentage of the industry's profit, and it begins to hurt. They learned that in Flock. And the whole idea of taking on a name brand like Campbell's, and ultimately, what the Flock was able to do was that they were able to put enough pressure on the industry that the industry called in the former Secretary of Labor, this guy John Marshall, as a mediator. And once that happened, all of a sudden now you got farm workers in the room and sitting at the table with people who thought that they were less than human. But there's negotiating a contract, and that's what I mean about organizing. That's the essence of organizing.
I mean, I was always more of a Progresso man myself. So, but can you talk to us about Neighbor to Neighbor and the Folgers boycott? Because it says over here that Folgers was selling Salvadorian beans. I used to work in coffee. I'm also half Salvadorian, so let's hear it.
Well, many of us again who had this relationship with the farm workers. The war in Central America, the El Salvadorian War, the Nicaraguan War, was being supported by the United States. This is the Reagan administration, and we opposed the investment, and we imposed those dictators that were there. And so we started Neighbor to Neighbor around supporting the people in Central America, and we targeted a coffee company that was getting their beans from Folgers, from El Salvador, and it was a classic kind of they really exploited and extracted from the people and gave the people nothing. In part because there was a dictatorship and the people only the dictator's people and the people that are part of the dictatorship benefited. The people never benefited. And that's why they were going to war. And so we were a part of, I and others, most of us worked again in the farm works, or who had been influenced or trained by those of us who had been in the farm workers. And so we got together and took what we knew, applied it, and applied that approach to pressuring Folgers to pull out of El Salvador and allow the people of El Salvador to be self-determined. And we were reasonably successful in that. And one of the things that we did was we created we raised money. We bought full-page ads in the New York Times, and then they created this television commercial, which got banned, which was the best thing that could have happened. And it was, you were pouring this coffee in a cup, but blood was running out of here.
Whoa, that's cool as hell.
And of course, so we bought television time, and Folgers was like, you can't sell it. And so they banned us. They wouldn't let us. That then gave us, that was like adding air, blowing air on a fire. And so then we did a whole bit, we showed up at a radio station with cash money in a briefcase and said, they won't take our money because Folgers, is trying to block our free speech, which gave us more. It did more than the commercials would have done.
But do you know those commercials are still available out there?
Oh man, maybe if they're going out, everything's on YouTube
maybe
now.
We'll do a deep dive and put that on the socials.
But those, I wound up being one night we decided Folgers was based in San Francisco, so we were going to do this round the clock picket. And I wound up being the Folgers brother, because they had depicted the Folgers person as a native person, so I wound up doing that. But from that grew a number of other things. But that ad, I think, was really hard hitting. Now, we had raised money to buy ads in full page ads in the L.A. Times and New York Times and the Washington Post to do two things: one, to educate people about the issue; two, to put pressure on elected officials and the Reagan administration in particular. But more importantly, to let the people in El Salvador know that their struggle was heard, and there were people, as Salvadorians, and people in the U.S. who were working with them.
Wow.
That neighbor to neighbor then went from that to fighting for single payer health care.
Oh, wow. Okay. Damn.
So that's how I got into single payer. But I'm surprised y'all ain't finding that out.
It's coming. It's coming.
You just finished listening to the first part of our podcast with Baba Akili. Tune back in for the final part this Friday, where we'll dive into his time as a national organizer for Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign, his time organizing with SEIU, Black Lives Matter, and more. And we'll hear why he's running for the 57th Assembly District in the state of California. Be sure to share this with all your homies in and outside of the movement. And as always, fuck 12.